The village that remembered. Too much. There are villages that forget, and there are villages that remember everything. Rosewood belonged firmly to the latter. It lay tucked away behind a veil of ancient oak trees and hedgerows that seemed to whisper secrets to one another. To an outsider, it was a place of peaceful charm. Stone cottages draped in ivy, a modest church with a leaning bell tower, and a scattering of rose gardens that gave the village its name. But beneath that tranquil exterior, Rosewood possessed a memory as long and unforgiving as the roots of its oldest trees. Miss Marple, who had arrived just 3 days prior, had already observed as much. She sat now by the window of her modest guest room at the Rosewood Inn, her knitting needles moving with quiet precision. Outside, a faint autumn mist curled along the narrow lane, blurring the outlines of the village into something almost dreamlike. But Miss Marple's pale blue eyes were sharp, alert, taking in every detail, every passing face, every subtle shift in tone that might otherwise escape notice. Villages, she often said, were like families, and families, no matter how respectable, always had their skeletons. "Ah, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Cartwright, the innkeeper, bustling in with a tray of tea. "You've chosen quite a time to visit us, I'm afraid." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, I was under the impression that autumn in Rosewood is quite lovely." Mrs. Cartwright hesitated, placing the teacup down with a faint clatter. "Lovely, yes, but unsettled." "What with everything that's happened?" Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "You refer to Mrs. Ashford?" "I presume?" The innkeeper's lips tightened. "Poor Lady Eleanor. Such a tragedy. Though," she lowered her voice instinctively, "some say it wasn't natural." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Indeed? And what do you say, Mrs. Cartwright?" The woman flushed slightly. "Well, I wouldn't like to speculate, but Lady Eleanor was as strong as an ox for all her age. Not the sort to simply slip away in her sleep." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet, that is precisely what the doctor has declared." "So they say." Mrs. Cartwright leaned closer. "But it's not just that, you see. It's what came before." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Before? The letter, and the young man. Miss Marple said nothing, but her stillness invited continuation. 2 days before Lady Eleanor passed, Mrs. Cartwright continued, a letter arrived. Caused quite a stir at the manor from what I've heard, and then, just yesterday, a gentleman appeared, claims he's her grandson, the long-lost heir. Miss Marple's fingers paused over her teacup. "How very timely," she murmured. Rosewood Manor stood on the edge of the village, slightly elevated, as though it preferred to look down upon the rest of the world. It was a grand house, though time had softened its edges. The stone facade bore the marks of age, and the gardens, once meticulously kept, had grown just a touch wild, as though mourning their mistress. Miss Marple approached the manor gates that afternoon, her steps measured and unhurried. She had always found that arriving too quickly at a mystery often frightened away the truth. The gate stood open. A young maid admitted her, clearly flustered but polite enough. "You've come to see Mr. Ashford, ma'am." "If he is receiving visitors," Miss Marple replied. The maid hesitated. "Well, he is, but it's all a bit confusing, if you don't mind my saying." Miss Marple smiled kindly. Most things are at first. She was led into a drawing room that bore all the hallmarks of faded elegance. Heavy curtains framed tall windows, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls. One in particular caught her eye, a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, with a certain defiance in his expression. "Richard Ashford," came a voice behind her. "My uncle." Miss Marple turned. The man standing before her was perhaps 30, with dark hair neatly combed and a face that might have been handsome, were it not for a certain tension about the eyes. He bowed slightly. "Edward Ashford," he said. I understand you wish to see me." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you for receiving me, Mr. Ashford. I hope I'm not intruding at a difficult time." His expression softened, though only just. Difficult is one way to describe it. My grandmother's passing was unexpected. "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "I understand she was in good health." "So it seemed." He gestured toward a chair. "Please, sit." She did so, studying him with quiet interest. "And you arrived," she said, "shortly after her death?" A flicker crossed his face. "Yes, I came as soon as I heard." How did you hear? Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. Through a solicitor in London, Edward replied smoothly. He contacted me after receiving a letter from my grandmother. She had been searching for me, you see, for years. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. How very fortunate that you were found. Yes, he said, though the word seemed to linger in the air uncertain. Tell me, Mr. Ashford, Miss Marple continued, had you ever met your grandmother before? No, his answer came quickly. My father, Richard, left Rosewood long before I was born. There was some disagreement. He never spoke of it. And yet, Miss Marple said softly, you felt compelled to come. He met her gaze directly. She was family. That matters. Miss Marple smiled, but there was something faintly distant in it. Of course, she said. Later that evening, Miss Marple walked through the village, her thoughts quietly arranging themselves. The story, on the surface, was simple enough. A long-lost heir summoned by a letter, a grandmother eager for reconciliation, and then her sudden death. But simplicity, Miss Marple knew, there was often a disguise. As she passed the churchyard, she noticed a figure standing by the gate, an elderly man leaning on a cane, his face half hidden in shadow. Good evening, Miss Marple said. The man looked up, his eyes sharp despite his age. Evening. You knew Lady Eleanor? She asked. He gave a short, humourless laugh. Knew her all my life. Strong woman. Too strong, some would say. Miss Marple tilted her head. You don't believe she died naturally? Do you? He countered. Miss Marple considered. I think, she said slowly, that timing is a curious thing. The man nodded. Aye, and there's more than timing that's off. Oh? He leaned closer, lowering his voice. That boy at the manor calls himself an Ashford, but I've seen enough in my years to know when something doesn't sit right. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly. And what is it, she asked, that doesn't sit right? The old man tapped his cane against the ground. It's not what he says, he murmured. It's what he doesn't. Miss Marple did not reply at once. Instead, she looked back toward the distant outline of Rosewood Manor, barely visible through the evening mist. A missing heir, a dead matriarch, and a village that remembered everything. Yes, she said quietly, I believe I shall stay a little longer. And as the mist thickened around her, Miss Marple felt the faint, familiar stir of a puzzle, one that promised not only deception, but something far more dangerous, something personal. Miss Marple had always maintained that the past was never truly past. It simply waited, quietly and patiently, for the right moment to step forward. The following morning in Rosewood dawned pale and cool, with a thin veil of fog still clinging to the hedgerows. The village stirred slowly to life, though there was a distinct heaviness in the air, as though the events of recent days had unsettled even the most ordinary routines. Miss Marple, having finished her modest breakfast, set out with a purpose that appeared to any observer quite aimless. She paused at the florist's window, admired a cluster of late-blooming roses, and exchanged pleasantries with a passing milkman. But behind her gentle demeanour, her mind was carefully assembling fragments, small details, half-spoken words, inconsistencies that refused to settle neatly. It was not long before she found herself outside the Rosewood post office. If there was one place where truth tended to linger in quiet corners, it was here. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and polish. Behind the counter stood Miss Eliza Green, a woman of indeterminate age with keen eyes, and a manner that suggested she noticed far more than she ever said. "Good morning," Miss Marple greeted warmly. Miss Green looked up, offering a polite smile. "Good morning. Settling in well, are you?" "Very much so," Miss Marple replied. "Rosewood is quite memorable." Miss Green gave a small, knowing nod. "It has a way of being so." Miss Marple approached the counter, lowering her voice slightly. "I understand there has been a great deal of excitement lately, with Lady Eleanor's passing and her grandson's return." The postmistress hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Yes," she said carefully. "Quite unexpected." Miss Marple studied her. "You handled the post for the manor, I believe?" "I have for years," Miss Green confirmed. "And the letter that arrived for Lady Eleanor shortly before her death, was it unusual in any way?" Miss Green's fingers stilled over a stack of envelopes. "Unusual?" "In its origin, perhaps," Miss Marple said lightly. "Or its urgency." The silence stretched just long enough to be meaningful. "It came from London," Miss Green said at last. "A solicitor's office. Nothing particularly strange about that." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "and yet it caused quite a stir." Miss Green met her gaze. "Letters often do, Miss Marple, especially when they bring back things people would rather leave forgotten." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite so." By late morning, Miss Marple had made her way to the small tea room near the village green, a cosy establishment known as the Briar Cup. It was the sort of place where conversations drifted easily from one table to another, carried on the gentle clink of china. She had scarcely taken her seat when she was joined by Mrs. Dalton, a plump, kindly woman with an unmistakable air of curiosity. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" Mrs. Dalton said, settling herself opposite without waiting for an invitation. "I've heard you're visiting from St. Mary Mead." "Yes," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, "just for a short stay." "Well," Mrs. Dalton said, leaning in conspiratorially, "you've chosen quite the time. The whole village is talking of nothing but the Ashford business." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "So I gather." Mrs. Dalton lowered her voice. "Do you believe he's genuine?" "My dear Mrs. Dalton," Miss Marple said gently, "belief is such a flexible thing. I prefer to observe." "Oh, but there are things that simply don't add up," Mrs. Dalton insisted. "For one, no one here ever heard of a grandson. Richard Ashford left years ago, decades really, and never came back. Lady Eleanor never spoke of him after that." "How curious," Miss Marple murmured. "And then," Mrs. Dalton continued, "this young man appears right after that letter arrives, as though he'd been waiting for it." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Tell me, Mrs. Dalton, what sort of man was Richard Ashford?" At this, Mrs. Dalton's expression shifted. "Troubled," she said after a moment. "Charming, yes, but reckless. There was some scandal, though no one ever spoke of it openly. After that, he left Rosewood and never returned." "And Lady Eleanor?" Miss Marple asked. "Fiercely proud," Mrs. Dalton replied. "She ruled that manor like a queen. But there was always something hard about her, as though she'd made choices she couldn't quite forgive herself for." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Choices. Yes, that seemed a promising direction. That afternoon, Miss Marple found herself once again at Rosewood Manor. This time she was received not by Edward Ashford, but by a woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Harbury, the housekeeper. She was tall, austere, and possessed of a composure that suggested she had seen more than most, and kept it to herself. "You wish to see the study?" Mrs. Harbury asked. "If it is not too much trouble," Miss Marple said. The housekeeper hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, but I must ask that you do not disturb anything. The police have not yet completed their inquiries." "Of course," Miss Marple said. The study was a dimly lit room lined with bookshelves, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and polished wood. A large desk stood near the window, its surface meticulously arranged. Miss Marple approached it slowly, her eyes taking in every detail. "Lady Eleanor was found here?" she asked. Mrs. Harbury inclined her head. "Yes, seated at her desk, as though she had simply fallen asleep." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the chair. "And the letter?" "In that drawer," Mrs. Harbury said, indicating a small compartment. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside lay a single envelope, neatly folded. "May I?" she asked. The housekeeper gave a brief nod. Miss Marple withdrew the letter, her eyes scanning its contents. It was, as expected, from a solicitor in London. Formal, precise, and entirely unremarkable, except for one thing. Miss Marple read it again, more slowly this time. Then she smiled. "Something interesting?" Mrs. Harbury asked. Miss Marple folded the letter and replaced it exactly as she had found it. "Oh yes," she said softly. "Very interesting indeed." As she stepped out into the fading afternoon light, Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty begin to take shape. The letter, it seemed, was not what it claimed to be, nor, she suspected, was the man who had answered it. But there was something deeper at work here, something that went beyond inheritance or identity, something rooted in the past. That evening, as she sat once more by her window at the inn, Miss Marple resumed her knitting. The rhythmic movement of the needles helped her think. A long-lost son, a scandal never spoken of, a letter that did not quite ring true, and a grandson who had arrived just in time. "Yes," she murmured to herself. The past has a way of arranging things, if one is patient enough to notice. Outside, the mist returned, curling around the village like a secret waiting to be told. And somewhere, beneath layers of silence and time, the truth of Rosewood Manor stirred, restless, insistent, and not yet ready to be buried. Miss Marple had often observed that people revealed themselves far more in the ordinary moments than in the dramatic ones. It was not in grand declarations or carefully rehearsed stories, but in the smallest hesitations, a pause before answering, a glance held just a fraction too long, that truth quietly emerged. It was with this thought in mind that she returned, once again, to Rosewood Manor. The morning had cleared beautifully, the mist lifting to reveal sharp autumn sunlight that cast long shadows across the gravel drive. The house stood as it always had, imposing, dignified, and faintly watchful. Yet Miss Marple could not help but feel that something within it had shifted. A presence, perhaps, or an absence. This time, Edward Ashford himself received her. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone polite but edged with something less easily defined. "I hadn't expected to see you again so soon." "My visits must seem rather persistent," she replied gently. "I hope you will forgive an old woman's curiosity." He managed a faint smile. "Curiosity is hardly a crime." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "though it can be inconvenient." There was a brief silence before he gestured for her to enter. "I suppose," he said, "that in a village like Rosewood, nothing remains private for long." Miss Marple took a seat, her eyes drifting momentarily to the portraits on the wall. "Privacy," she said softly, "is often more illusion than reality." Edward did not respond immediately. Instead, he poured tea with careful precision. "You've spoken with the villagers, I imagine," he said at last. "A few," Miss Marple admitted. "They remember a great deal." "Yes," he said quietly, "so I've gathered." Miss Marple accepted the teacup, studying him over its rim. "It must be quite overwhelming, to return to a place filled with memories that are not your own." For the first time his composure faltered, just slightly. "You make it sound rather unnatural," he said. "Not unnatural," Miss Marple replied, "simply difficult." He leaned back, regarding her with a more direct gaze. "You don't believe I am who I say I am?" It was not a question. Miss Marple set her cup down with deliberate care. "Belief," she said, "is a curious thing. It tends to follow evidence." "And what does the evidence suggest?" "That," Miss Marple said, her voice as mild as ever, "is what I am still determining." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself walking along a narrow lane that led away from the manor and toward the edge of the woods. She had been told, quite casually, that the old gardener still lived in a small cottage nearby. In villages, gardeners often knew more than anyone else. They saw who came and went, who lingered too long, who avoided certain paths. The cottage was modest but well kept, surrounded by carefully tended flower beds that defied the lateness of the season. An elderly man sat on a wooden bench outside, trimming a cluster of rose stems with steady hands. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple said. The man looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly before softening. "Afternoon. You must be Mr. Wilkes," she continued. "I was told you worked at the manor for many years." "Aye," he said. "Longer than most care to remember." Miss Marple smiled. "Then you must have known the Ashford family quite well?" He gave a short grunt. "Well enough." She took a seat beside him, her movements unhurried. "I wonder if you might tell me about Richard Ashford." At the name, Mr. Wilkes's hand stilled. "Why?" he asked. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Because it seems to me that understanding the past is often the only way to make sense of the present." He studied her for a long moment, as though weighing something. "Richard," he said at last, "wasn't like the others. Had charm, yes, but there was always trouble close behind him. He didn't belong in Rosewood. Not really." "And yet he was born here," Miss Marple observed. "Born here, yes," Mr. Wilkes said. "But some people carry the feeling of elsewhere with them, like they're meant to be somewhere else entirely." Miss Marple considered this. "And his departure? Was it sudden?" The old man nodded. "Very. One day he was here, the next he was gone. No goodbyes, no explanations." "Was there a reason?" she asked gently. Mr. Wilkes hesitated. "There was talk," he said finally. "Nothing proven, mind you, but talk has a way of sticking." "What sort of talk?" He glanced toward the distant outline of the manor. "A girl," he said, From the village. Things didn't end well. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Do you recall her name? The old man shook his head. Doesn't matter now, she left soon after, never came back. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And Lady Eleanor? She asked. How did she react to all this? Mr. Wilkes's expression hardened. She shut it all down. Wouldn't hear a word of it. Sent Richard away and made sure no one spoke his name again. Quite decisive, Miss Marple murmured. Aye, he said. Too decisive, some might say. As Miss Marple made her way back toward the village, her thoughts moved carefully through what she had learned. A scandal. A young woman who had disappeared. A son cast out and never spoken of again. And now a grandson, returning after all these years. But something did not fit. It was not merely the timing, though, that was suspicious enough. Nor was it the letter, which she had already begun to suspect was not entirely genuine. No, it was something else. Something about Edward Ashford himself. She recalled the way he had spoken of his father. The absence of detail. The careful neutrality. It was not the voice of a man remembering. It was the voice of a man reciting. And then there was his face. Miss Marple paused in the middle of the lane, her knitting bag hanging loosely at her side. Faces, she had often found, could be most revealing. Not in their features, but in their familiarity. Edward Ashford bore a resemblance to the portrait in the drawing-room. Of that there was no doubt. The same dark hair, the same structure of the jaw. And yet... Miss Marple frowned slightly. It was not the resemblance that troubled her. It was the lack of something else. A likeness, when genuine, carried with it a certain ease, a natural continuity. But Edward's resemblance felt studied, as though it had been constructed rather than inherited. Yes, she murmured to herself. A face that fits, but does not belong. That evening, as the village settled into its quiet rhythms, Miss Marple sat once more by her window. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves, though not yet into a complete picture. A missing heir, a forgotten scandal, a letter that had summoned the past, and a man who wore his identity like a carefully tailored suit, perfect in appearance, but somehow lacking in comfort. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the soft click of the needles filling the silence. Impostors, she said softly, are rarely undone by what they say. Her eyes lifted toward the darkened outline of Rosewood Manor in the distance. They are undone, she continued, by what they cannot quite become. And somewhere, deep within that house of memories and secrets, something was waiting to be uncovered. Something that had been hidden for far too long. Miss Marple had slept very little that night. Not from discomfort. Her room at the Rosewood Inn was quite adequate. But from the quiet insistence of a thought that refused to settle. It hovered just beyond clarity, like a word on the tip of one's tongue. And Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime pursuing such elusive truths, knew better than to ignore it. The letter. It had seemed so ordinary at first glance, precisely the sort of document one might expect from a London solicitor. Its phrasing was formal, its structure correct, and its purpose entirely plausible. And yet, Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly as she sat in the small breakfast room. The morning light streamed in gently, illuminating the delicate pattern of the china cup before her. Too correct, she murmured. Beg your pardon? Mrs. Cartwright asked, pausing mid-step with a teapot in hand. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. Oh, nothing of importance, merely thinking aloud. But it was of importance, very much so. There was a particular quality to genuine correspondence, an imperfection, a subtle irregularity that came from human habit. But the letter in Lady Eleanor's study had possessed none of that. It had been immaculate, and that Miss Marple knew was often the first sign of something carefully constructed. Determined to examine the matter further, Miss Marple made her way once again to the village post office. Miss Eliza Green looked up as she entered, her expression polite but tinged with curiosity. Back again, Miss Marple? I hope I'm not becoming a nuisance, Miss Marple said lightly. Not at all, Miss Green replied. Though I suspect you don't come here without reason. Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. You're quite right. I was hoping you might indulge me in a small matter of detail. Miss Green folded her hands. I'll do what I can. It concerns the letter sent to Lady Eleanor from London, Miss Marple said. You mentioned it came from a solicitor. Do you happen to recall the name? Miss Green nodded slowly. Harrington and Blythe. A respectable firm as far as I know." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "And the envelope, did it bear a proper postmark?" "Of course," Miss Green replied, though her tone suggested the question struck her as odd. "Stamped and sorted like any other." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And yet, you hesitate." Miss Green's gaze sharpened. "Do I?" "Only very slightly," Miss Marple said gently. "But enough to suggest that something about it did not entirely satisfy you." There was a pause. Then Miss Green exhaled softly. "It's a small thing," she admitted. "Hardly worth mentioning." "Small things," Miss Marple said, "are often the most revealing." Miss Green glanced toward the door as though ensuring they were alone. "The stamp," she said quietly. "It was London, yes, but not quite right. The ink was smudged, as though it had been handled more than usual. I remember thinking it odd, but, well, one doesn't question such things without cause." Miss Marple's eyes brightened ever so slightly. "No," she agreed, "one does not, unless one has a reason." From the post office, Miss Marple went directly to the solicitor's office in the nearby town, a modest establishment with an air of quiet respectability. Mr. Jameson, the clerk who received her, listened patiently as she explained her inquiry. "Harrington and Blythe," he repeated. "Yes, I'm familiar with them, a well-established firm." "And they would have sent a letter recently to Lady Eleanor Ashford of Rosewood Manor?" Miss Marple asked. Mr. Jameson consulted a ledger, his brow furrowing slightly. "Not to my knowledge," he said, "but I could make a formal inquiry if you wish." "That would be most helpful," Miss Marple replied. He nodded, though I must say it would be unusual for such a letter to go unrecorded. Firms like theirs are quite meticulous. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "so I have observed." By the time she returned to Rosewood, the afternoon had begun to fade into evening. The village seemed quieter than before, as though the weight of recent events had settled more deeply into its bones. Miss Marple, however, felt a distinct sense of clarity. The letter had not been sent by the solicitor, which meant it had been sent by someone else, someone who wanted Lady Eleanor to believe her grandson had been found, someone who had ensured that belief arrived just before her death. That evening, Miss Marple was invited, somewhat unexpectedly, to dine at Rosewood Manor. Edward Ashford received her with a politeness that bordered on formality. "I thought," he said, as they took their seats at the long dining table, "that it might be useful to speak more openly." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I always find conversation useful." The meal began in silence, broken only by the faint clink of cutlery. But it was not long before Miss Marple spoke. You must forgive my persistence," she said, "but I find myself particularly interested in the letter that brought you here." Edward's hand paused. "Yes," he said. "It was most fortunate," Miss Marple continued, "that it reached you at precisely the right moment." He set his fork down. "I don't see what you're suggesting." "Only that timing," Miss Marple said gently, "is rarely accidental." Edward's gaze hardened slightly. "The letter came from a solicitor. There is nothing suspicious about that." Miss Marple met his eyes calmly, except that it did not. The silence that followed was absolute. Edward leaned back slowly, his expression unreadable. "I beg your pardon?" "The firm in question," Miss Marple said, "has no record of sending such a letter, which suggests that it was written elsewhere." Edward's lips tightened. "That's absurd." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked. For a moment neither spoke. Then Edward gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Even if that were true, what would it prove? That someone wished to reunite me with my family? Hardly a crime." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "not in itself." She paused, her voice softening. "But when such a letter precedes a sudden and unexplained death, one cannot help but wonder." Edward stood abruptly. "Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple remained seated, her expression composed. "I am suggesting," she said, "that someone went to considerable effort to create a story, and that stories, when examined closely, often reveal their authors." Edward said nothing, but in that moment something shifted. The carefully constructed calm, the measured responses, it all seemed to strain, just slightly, under the weight of scrutiny. Miss Marple rose slowly. "Thank you for your hospitality," she said. "It has been most enlightening." As she stepped out into the cool evening air, Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty settle within her. The letter had lied, and if the letter had lied, then so almost certainly had the man who answered it. But the question remained, why? Inheritance alone did not explain such careful deception. No, there was something deeper, something rooted in the past, something that had waited patiently for its moment. Miss Marple looked back at the darkened windows of Rosewood Manor. Yes, she murmured, the truth is beginning to show itself. And when it did, she suspected, it would not be gentle. Miss Marple had always believed that when a story refused to make sense, it was often because a crucial character had been quietly removed from it. In Rosewood, that character was beginning to take shape, not as a presence, but as an absence. The girl. She rose early the next morning, her thoughts already arranged with gentle precision. There was a softness to the day, a pale gold sunlight filtering through the thinning leaves, but Miss Marple paid it little attention. Her mind was elsewhere, walking through memories that did not belong to her, reconstructing events from fragments others had half forgotten. After a modest breakfast, she set out toward the far end of the village where the older cottages stood, slightly removed from the centre. It was there, she had been told, that one might find Mrs. Barlow, a woman who had lived in Rosewood all her life, and possessed, according to Mrs. Cartwright, a memory that bordered on inconvenient. Miss Marple found her exactly as described, seated by a low window, wrapped in a shawl despite the mildness of the morning, her sharp eyes fixed on the world outside. "Good morning," Miss Marple said as she approached. Mrs. Barlow turned her head slowly. "You're the visitor," she said, "the one asking questions." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I hope I'm not causing distress." "Distress?" Mrs. Barlow gave a dry chuckle. "My dear, Rosewood has seen worse than curiosity." Miss Marple took a seat opposite her. "I was hoping you might help me with something from the past." "That depends," Mrs. Barlow replied. "The past is not always eager to be helped." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I'm looking for a young woman, someone who lived here many years ago, around the time Richard Ashford left." At the name, Mrs. Barlow's expression sharpened. "Ah," she said quietly, "so that's where your questions are leading." "You remember her," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Barlow did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for a small cup of tea, her hands steady despite her age. "Yes," she said at last, "I remember her." "Would you tell me?" The old woman studied Miss Marple for a long moment, as though deciding whether the truth would be safe in her care. "Her name was Clara Whitmore," she said finally. "A quiet girl. Not from a grand family, but respectable enough. She worked at the manor for a time, helping with the household." Miss Marple listened closely. "She was different," Mrs. Barlow continued, "not the sort to draw attention to herself. But Richard noticed her." Miss Marple's eyes softened slightly. "And she noticed him?" Mrs. Barlow gave a faint, sad smile. "Of course she did. Girls like Clara don't often get noticed by men like Richard Ashford. It must have felt like something out of a story." "And how did the story end?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Mrs. Barlow's smile faded. "Not well," she said. "There were whispers. People began to talk. Clara grew pale, withdrawn. And then she was gone." "Gone?" Miss Marple repeated. "Vanished," Mrs. Barlow said. "No farewell, no explanation. One day she was there, the next she wasn't. And not long after, Richard left as well." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Did no one try to find her?" Mrs. Barlow's gaze turned distant. "In villages like this, my dear, people don't look too closely at things that make them uncomfortable." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And Lady Eleanor?" she asked. "Or what was her reaction?" At this, Mrs. Barlow's expression hardened. "She put an end to it," she said. "Whatever had happened, she made sure it was buried. Clara's name was not spoken again. It was as though the girl had never existed." Miss Marple's voice was very soft. "But she did exist." "Yes," Mrs. Barlow said firmly, "she did." As Miss Marple left the cottage, the weight of the story settled heavily in her mind. Clara Whitmore, a quiet girl, a fleeting romance, or something more. A sudden disappearance, and a silence enforced by a woman who ruled her world with absolute authority. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the village centre, her thoughts threading carefully through what she had learned. If Clara had simply left, there would have been some trace, a letter, a sighting, a rumour that persisted. but there had been nothing. No one had seen her again, which suggested one of two possibilities. Either she had gone somewhere very far away, or she'd never left at all. Miss Marple paused, her gaze drifting toward the distant silhouette of Rosewood Manor. "Yes," she murmured, "that is the question, isn't it?" That afternoon Miss Marple returned to the manor, not through the front entrance this time, but by way of the gardens. They were overgrown in places, though still bearing the faint structure of what they had once been. Roses climbed trellises in tangled profusion, and narrow paths wound through beds of late-blooming flowers. It was there that she found Mrs. Harbury, the housekeeper, supervising a young maid who was attempting, with limited success, to restore some order to the grounds. "Mrs. Harbury," Miss Marple called gently. The housekeeper turned, her expression composed as ever. "Miss Marple?" "I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said. "Not at all," Mrs. Harbury replied, "though I must admit your visits have become frequent." Miss Marple smiled. "I find Rosewood quite fascinating." Mrs. Harbury said nothing, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps curiosity, perhaps caution. "I was hoping," Miss Marple continued, "to ask you about someone who once worked here, a young woman named Clara Whitmore." For the briefest moment Mrs. Harbury's composure cracked. It was subtle, a tightening of the jaw, a slight shift in posture, but Miss Marple did not miss it. "I'm afraid I don't recall the name," Mrs. Harbury said. Miss Marple regarded her quietly. "How strange. From what I understand, she lived here for some time. Many people have lived here," Mrs. Harbury replied coolly. "One cannot remember them all." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but one does tend to remember those who leave suddenly." Mrs. Harbury's gaze hardened. "If you have a point to make, Miss Marple, I suggest you do so plainly." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Only this, that the past has a way of returning, even when one tries very hard to forget it." The housekeeper said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. That evening Miss Marple sat once more by her window, her knitting untouched in her lap. The pieces were no longer scattered, they were beginning to form a pattern. Clara Whitmore, Richard Ashford, a scandal buried, a disappearance unexplained, and now a supposed grandson, arriving with a false letter at precisely the right moment. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, allowing the connections to settle. "Revenge," she murmured. Yes, that was the word that fit. Not inheritance, not coincidence, but something far more deliberate. If Clara Whitmore had suffered, if she had been cast aside, silenced, erased, then someone might have carried that wound forward, someone who had waited, someone who had returned not as themselves, but as something else entirely. Miss Marple opened her eyes, her gaze steady. "The heir of Rosewood," she said softly, "may not be an heir at all." And somewhere, in the shadows of the manor and the memories of the village, the truth drew closer, quiet, patient, and inevitable. Miss Marple had long held the opinion that names were rarely accidental. They carried history, intention, and sometimes, when chosen carefully enough, a deliberate illusion. The name Edward Ashford was beginning to trouble her. It was not simply that the letter had been false, nor that his arrival had been suspiciously timed. It was something subtler, something that had lingered at the edges of her thoughts since their very first meeting. Now, as she sat in the quiet corner of the Rosewood Inn sitting room, that unease began to take shape. "Edward," she murmured softly. "Yes, but why Edward?" She set her knitting aside. It would not do to ignore such a question. Her first destination that morning was the small church at the heart of the village. The building itself was modest but dignified, its stone walls softened by age and climbing ivy. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of old wood and candle wax. Reverend Paulson, a kindly man with thinning hair and an expression of permanent concern, greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple," he said, "a pleasure to see you again. How may I assist you?" "I was hoping," she said gently, "to consult the parish records. Births, perhaps, from many years ago." The Reverend hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course, though I must warn you, some of the older entries are not as complete as one might wish." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Incomplete records can be quite revealing, in their own way." He led her to a small room at the back of the church, where a series of worn ledgers rested on a wooden table. "Take your time," he said before quietly withdrawing. Miss Marple sat down and began to turn the pages with careful precision. Names, dates, lives recorded in ink, each one a small fragment of the village's long memory. She searched for Richard Ashford first. It did not take long to find him. There he was, recorded neatly. His birth marked with the same formality as any other. Beneath it, a brief note of confirmation, a baptism witnessed by the usual figures of the time. Nothing unusual. But then Miss Marple's finger moved further down the page. She paused. Then she frowned. There was no record of any child born to Richard Ashford. Not in the years before his departure, not in the years after. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Curious," she murmured. If Richard had indeed fathered a child, if Edward's story were true, there should have been some trace. Even in secrecy such things left marks. But here there was nothing. Later that afternoon Miss Marple returned to the village green, her mind quietly assembling its conclusions. If Edward Ashford did not exist in the records, then where had he come from? She found part of her answer sooner than expected. Mrs. Dalton, ever eager for conversation, approached her with a look of particular excitement. "Miss Marple," she said, lowering her voice, "you'll never guess what I've just heard." Miss Marple smiled patiently. "I suspect you're about to tell me." Mrs. Dalton glanced around before leaning closer. "It's about the young man at the manor, Edward." "Yes?" Miss Marple prompted. "He's been asking questions," Mrs. Dalton said. "About the village, about the past, about people who haven't been spoken of in years." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Such as?" Mrs. Dalton hesitated. "Clara Whitmore." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but something in her eyes did. "Indeed," she said softly. "He asked old Mr. Wilkes about her," Mrs. Dalton continued, "and Miss Green at the post office. Even tried to speak with Mrs. Barlow, though she sent him away." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "How very diligent of him." "Yes," Mrs. Dalton said, though her tone suggested unease. "But why would he care about someone like that? If he's truly an Ashford, I mean." Miss Marple did not answer immediately, because the answer, she suspected, was already forming. That evening, Miss Marple made a decision. If Edward Ashford was searching for Clara Whitmore, then perhaps Clara Whitmore had not been entirely lost to time. There were, after all, other ways of tracing a life. She returned to her room at the inn and sat quietly for a long while, her thoughts moving with careful deliberation. A young woman, vanished without a trace. A child, perhaps, unrecorded, unacknowledged. And years later, or a man appearing under a name that did not quite belong to him. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the arm of her chair. "Yes," she said softly. "That would explain it." The name Edward Ashford was not inherited. It was chosen, and names, when chosen, often served a purpose. The following morning brought with it a subtle shift in the atmosphere of Rosewood. There was a tension in the air now, as though the village itself had begun to sense that something was unravelling. Miss Marple, however, felt only clarity. She returned to Rosewood Manor one final time, not as a curious visitor, but as someone who had begun to understand. Edward Ashford was in the drawing-room when she arrived. He looked up as she entered, his expression guarded. "Miss Marple," he said, "I was beginning to think you had lost interest." "On the contrary," she replied gently, "I find myself more interested than ever." He studied her. "And what is it that interests you?" Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. "Your name," she said. For a moment he did not react. Then, very slowly, his expression changed. "I don't follow," he said. "Edward Ashford," Miss Marple continued. "A perfectly suitable name, respectable, believable, and yet—" She paused. "It does not exist." The silence that followed was absolute. Edward's eyes hardened. "That's nonsense." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked softly. "I have consulted the parish records. There is no record of your birth, no record of your father having a child, nothing to support your claim." He stood abruptly. "Records can be incomplete." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But not entirely absent." She took a step closer, her voice still gentle but unmistakably firm. "You have asked about Clara Whitmore," she said. "You have sought out those who remember her, which suggests that your interest in this village did not begin with a letter." Edward said nothing. but the tension in the room had become almost palpable. Miss Marple watched him carefully. "You are not who you claim to be," she said quietly. For a long moment he did not move. Then, at last, he spoke. "No," he said, and the single word seemed to echo in the silence that followed. Miss Marple did not appear surprised. "Then perhaps," she said gently, "you would care to tell me who you are." He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since she had entered, and in his eyes there was something new, not defiance, not deception, but something deeper, something that had been waiting for a very long time to be revealed. "That," he said quietly, "is a much longer story." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I have found that the truth often is." Outside, the wind stirred softly through the trees, carrying with it the faintest whisper of something long buried, and at last the past of Rosewood was beginning to speak. For a long moment after his quiet admission, the room seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple did not speak. She had learned over the years that silence, properly applied, could be far more persuasive than any question. It allowed truth to gather its strength, to step forward of its own accord. Edward Ashford, or the man who had called himself so, stood by the window, his back partially turned. The light fell unevenly across his face, casting one side in shadow. "You are very thorough, Miss Marple," he said at last, his voice calm but no longer guarded in quite the same way. "I suppose I should have expected as much." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "It is not thoroughness, I think, merely attention." He gave a faint, almost humourless smile. "Attention can be dangerous." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed gently, "especially when one has something to hide." There was no denial this time. Instead, he turned fully toward her, and in that movement something changed. The careful composure he had maintained until now seemed to loosen, as though it had served its purpose and was no longer required. "My name," he said slowly, "is not Edward Ashford." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I had gathered as much." He hesitated, then continued. "My name is Daniel Whitmore." The name settled into the room with quiet weight. Miss Marple did not react outwardly, but her eyes softened just slightly. "Whitmore," she repeated. "Then you are—" "Yes," he said. "Clara Whitmore was my mother." The confession, once begun, seemed to gather its own momentum. Daniel moved away from the window, his steps measured but no longer restrained by pretense. "She left this village many years ago," he said, "or at least, that is what people believed." Miss Marple watched him closely. "And in truth?" He gave a short, bitter laugh. "In truth, she had no choice. Whatever happened between her and Richard Ashford, it did not end as people imagined. She was sent away. Quietly. Efficiently. By Lady Eleanor," Miss Marple said softly. Daniel's gaze sharpened. "Of course. She controlled everything. The house. The family. The story that people were allowed to tell." Miss Marple said nothing, but her silence invited him to continue. "My mother never spoke much about it," he went on. "Not when I was young. But as she grew older, things began to slip through. Small details at first. A name, a place, a sense of something unfinished." "And she told you about Rosewood," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Daniel replied. "She told me enough." He paused, his expression tightening. "She told me about Richard," he added, "about how he promised things he never intended to keep, about how she was left to bear the consequences alone." Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. "And you?" "I was born in a place far from here," Daniel said, "raised without any connection to this village. But the story, it was always there. Like something waiting." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "And so you came?" "Yes." The single word carried with it years of quiet intention. "But why now?" Miss Marple asked. Daniel's gaze flickered briefly, then settled again. "Because my mother died," he said. The simplicity of it struck with unexpected force. "She died 6 months ago," he continued, "and in her final days, she spoke of Rosewood more than ever, of what had been taken from her, of how everything had been erased." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And you felt that something should be restored." "Something should be answered," Daniel said, his voice sharpening. "Do you know what it is to grow up with a story that never ends? To know that part of your life was taken from you before it even began?" Miss Marple did not respond immediately. "Yes," she said quietly. "I believe I do." The anger in his expression softened just slightly. "I didn't come for money," he said, "or for the estate. That's not what this is about." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It is about recognition." Daniel hesitated. "Yes," he said. "That is part of it." "And the letter?" Miss Marple asked gently. He looked at her, a flicker of something like reluctant admiration passing through his eyes. "You've already worked that out, haven't you?" "I have my suspicions," she said. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I wrote it. Or rather, I arranged for it to be written. It needed to be convincing. Official." "And it was," Miss Marple said. "Almost perfectly so." "Almost," he echoed. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perfection is often the most noticeable flaw." He gave a short nod. "Yes. I see that now." "And you sent it to Lady Eleanor," Miss Marple continued, "to prepare her for your arrival." "Yes." "Why?" Daniel's expression darkened slightly. "Because I wanted her to know," he said. "I wanted her to understand that the past had not disappeared, that it had returned." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "And did she understand?" He was silent for a moment. "Yes," he said at last. "I believe she did." Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her mind moving carefully through what she'd learned. Daniel Whitmore, the son of Clara Whitmore, a life shaped by absence, by silence, by a story deliberately erased, and now returned under a false name with a carefully constructed plan. "But there is still something missing," Miss Marple said softly. Daniel looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Your purpose," she replied. You have come here, you have confronted the past, you have revealed yourself, at least to me, but there is something more." His gaze held hers for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly, "there is." Miss Marple waited. "She died too easily," Daniel said. The words fell with quiet finality. Miss Marple's eyes did not leave his face. "Lady Eleanor," she said. "Yes." "And you believe—" "I believe," Daniel interrupted, "that she deserved to face what she had done, to understand it, to answer for it." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "And did she?" He hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty entered his expression. "I don't know," he said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with possibility. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. "Mr. Whitmore," she said gently, "you have told me a great deal. And I'm grateful for your honesty." He gave a faint, tired smile. "Honesty comes more easily once the pretense is gone." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "though it does not always bring comfort." He looked at her. "What will you do with what you know?" Miss Marple considered this for a moment. "I think," she said, "that there is still more to understand." His expression sharpened. "About what?" "About what happened in this house," she replied, "on the night Lady Eleanor died." Daniel's face stilled. "You think there is more?" Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. "I think," she said, "that truth rarely arrives in a single piece." As she left the manor, the late afternoon light stretched long across the gardens, casting everything in a golden, uncertain glow. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts precise and unhurried. Daniel Whitmore had come for answers, for recognition, perhaps even for justice. But justice, Miss Marple knew, was rarely simple, and something in his story, something in the way he had spoken of Lady Eleanor's death, did not sit entirely at ease. "She died too easily," he had said. "Yes, too easily." Miss Marple paused at the gate, her gaze drifting back toward the house. "Which suggests," she murmured softly, "that someone may have helped her. And if that were true, then the mystery of Rosewood was not yet solved. It had only just begun to reveal its final shape." Miss Marple had always believed that the truth of any household could be found not in its grand rooms, but in its quieter corners, places where people moved without being observed, where habits formed unnoticed, and where secrets often slipped free of careful control. Where it was with this thought that she returned once more to Rosewood Manor. But this time she did not come as a guest, she came as an observer. The evening had drawn in early, as autumn evenings often did. A soft darkness had settled over the grounds, broken only by the faint glow of lamplight from the manor windows. The house seemed quieter now than before, less occupied perhaps, or simply more watchful. Miss Marple had arranged, through Mrs. Harbury, to spend some time in the house under the pretence of offering assistance with the sorting of Lady Eleanor's belongings. It was a reasonable excuse, and one that granted her something far more valuable than access. It granted her time to notice, time to listen, time to reconstruct. The study where Lady Eleanor had been found remained largely untouched. Yes, Miss Marple stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim light. The desk, the chair, the carefully arranged papers, all exactly as they had been described. She moved slowly, her steps deliberate. "Evening, ma'am." Miss Marple turned to see the young maid, Lucy, if she recalled correctly, standing hesitantly by the door. "Good evening," Miss Marple said kindly. "I hope I'm not in your way." "Oh, no, ma'am," Lucy replied quickly. "Mrs. Harbury said you might be here." Miss Marple smiled. "Then perhaps you can help me with something." The girl nodded eagerly. "Of course." "You were here on the night Lady Eleanor passed, were you not?" Miss Marple asked. Lucy's expression shifted, uncertainty creeping in. "Yes, ma'am." "Would you mind telling me what you remember?" The girl hesitated, and glancing briefly down the corridor as though the house itself might overhear. "Well, it was quiet," she began. "Very quiet. Lady Eleanor had retired to her study as she often did in the evenings. Mr. Ashford—" She faltered, then corrected herself. "Mr. Whitmore, I mean, he was in the drawing-room for a while." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "You saw him?" "Yes, ma'am. He came in earlier that day, you see, and that evening he was walking about, asking questions." Miss Marple nodded. "And later?" Lucy shifted her weight. "I went to the kitchen for a bit. When I came back, I thought I heard something." "What sort of something?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Footsteps," Lucy said. "Soft ones, in the corridor near the study." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Did you see anyone?" The girl shook her head. "No, ma'am. By the time I looked, there was no one there." "Did you think it unusual?" Lucy hesitated. "At the time, not really. It's an old house. It makes sounds. But now—" Miss Marple finished the thought for her. "Now it feels different." "Yes," Lucy whispered. Miss Marple thanked the girl and returned her attention to the study. Footsteps. Quiet ones. Not Daniel Whitmore, then. Not necessarily. He had admitted to being in the house, but footsteps heard later suggested movement beyond his presence. Miss Marple moved toward the desk once more, her fingers lightly tracing its polished surface. Lady Eleanor had been found seated here. No sign of struggle, no sign of distress. A peaceful passing, they had said. Too peaceful. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the shelves lining the wall. Books, neatly arranged, and decorative objects placed with careful precision. And then, something small, almost insignificant, caught her attention. A glass, half hidden behind a stack of papers. Miss Marple stepped closer. It was a simple drinking glass, the sort one might use for water or perhaps a mild cordial. It had not been mentioned before, or if it had not been considered important. She picked it up carefully. There was a faint residue at the bottom. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Curious," she murmured. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Harbury in the small sitting-room reserved for staff. The housekeeper remained composed as always, but there was a tension beneath her calm that had not been there before. "You have been asking questions," Mrs. Harbury said. Miss Marple smiled gently. Only the sort that arise naturally." Mrs. Harbury regarded her steadily. "There is nothing unnatural about Lady Eleanor's death." Miss Marple did not respond immediately. Instead, she placed the glass she had found on the small table between them. "Is there not?" she said softly. Mrs. Harbury's gaze flickered to the glass, and for the briefest moment something changed. "Where did you find that?" she asked. "In the study," Miss Marple replied. "It seemed overlooked." Mrs. Harbury's expression tightened. "It is of no consequence." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said gently, "it may be of considerable consequence." The housekeeper said nothing. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Lady Eleanor was not a woman to leave things unattended," she said. "Everything in that room was arranged with care, and yet this glass, half hidden, partially used, suggests that something occurred outside her usual habits." Mrs. Harbury's voice was cool. "You're reading too much into it." "Am I?" Miss Marple asked. The silence stretched. Then, very quietly, Mrs. Harbury spoke. "She was not well," she said. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. And yet everyone in the village insists she was in excellent health. Mrs. Harbury's hands tightened slightly in her lap. There are things, she said, that are not for outsiders to understand. Miss Marple's voice softened. Perhaps, she said, but there are also things that cannot remain hidden. As the night deepened, Miss Marple returned to her room at the inn, her mind alive with quiet certainty. Footsteps in the corridor, a glass in the study, a housekeeper who knew more than she wished to say, and a man, Daniel Whitmore, whose arrival had set everything into motion. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting resting forgotten in her lap. This was not sudden, she murmured. No, Lady Eleanor's death had not been a simple passing. Something had been prepared, something had been administered, and someone had been present. But who? Daniel Whitmore had motive. Yes, that much was clear. But motive alone was not enough, and there was something in his manner, something in his uncertainty, that suggested he had not expected events to unfold as they had. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the distant silhouette of the manor. No, she said softly, there is another hand at work here. Someone who had moved quietly, someone who had taken advantage of the moment, and someone who had ensured that Lady Eleanor Ashford would never have the chance to answer for the past. And as the wind stirred faintly outside, Miss Marple felt the final pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift into place. The truth was very near now, and when it came, it would not be kind. Miss Marple had always maintained that a crime, no matter how carefully concealed, inevitably revealed itself through motive. Not the obvious motive, the one people spoke of openly, but the quieter, more personal kind, the sort that grew slowly over years, fed by memory, regret, or something far colder. By the time the next morning arrived, she was quite certain of one thing. Lady Eleanor Ashford had not died peacefully, and more importantly, she had not died alone. The village seemed restless that day. There was a subtle shift in the air, as though the weight of unspoken suspicion had begun to settle over Rosewood. Conversations faltered when others approached. Glances lingered just a little too long, and even the most ordinary interactions carried an undercurrent of unease. Miss Marple, however, moved through it all with her usual gentle composure. She had decided, quite firmly, that it was time to speak to everyone involved, not as a curious outsider, but as someone who was beginning to understand the truth. Her first call was upon Mrs. Harbury. The housekeeper received her in the same small sitting room as before, though this time her calm appeared more deliberate, more carefully maintained. "Miss Marple," she said, "you are persistent." "I find persistence useful," Miss Marple replied mildly. Mrs. Harbury inclined her head. "I suppose you have come with more questions." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "though I believe I already know most of the answers." The housekeeper's eyes narrowed slightly. "That is a dangerous assumption." "Only if one is wrong," Miss Marple said gently. She paused, then continued. "You told me that Lady Eleanor was not well," she said, "and yet no one else seems to share that view. In fact, quite the opposite." Mrs. Harbury remained silent. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Tell me," she said softly, "what was in the glass?" The question landed with quiet precision. For a moment Mrs. Harbury did not move. Then she spoke. "Nothing of consequence," she said. Miss Marple shook her head very slightly. "I'm afraid that is no longer convincing." The silence stretched. Then slowly Mrs. Harbury exhaled. "It was her medicine," she said. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Medicine?" "Yes." "For what condition?" Another pause. "Her heart," Mrs. Harbury said at last. "She had been taking something for it. A mild preparation, perfectly safe." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "And who prepared it?" she asked. Mrs. Harbury hesitated. "I did," she said. Miss Marple did not respond immediately. Instead, she allowed the answer to settle. "You were with her that evening?" she asked. "No," Mrs. Harbury replied quickly. "I left the tray outside the study, as I always did. She preferred not to be disturbed." "And yet," Miss Marple said quietly, "someone entered the room after that." Mrs. Harbury's composure faltered, just slightly. "I cannot say," she replied. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but you may suspect." The housekeeper's gaze dropped for a brief moment before lifting again. "I suspect nothing," she said. But her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple rose. "Thank you," she said gently. "You have been most helpful." Mrs. Harbury did not reply, but as Miss Marple reached the door she spoke again. "She was not a kind woman," she said. Miss Marple paused. "No," she agreed softly, "I do not think she was." From the manor, Miss Marple made her way directly to the gardener's cottage. Mr. Wilkes was once again seated outside, though this time his expression was more guarded. "You've come back," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "There are still things to understand," he grunted. "There always are." Miss Marple took a seat beside him. "You were at the manor on the evening Lady Eleanor died, were you not?" she asked. Mr. Wilkes stiffened slightly. "Who told you that?" "No one," Miss Marple said. But you have a habit of keeping watch over the place. Old loyalties are not easily abandoned." He studied her for a long moment. Then he sighed. "Aye," he admitted. "I was there, in the garden, not inside." "What did you see?" Miss Marple asked. "Not much," he said. "Lights in the study. Someone moving inside, I think. Hard to tell from where I was." "Someone other than Lady Eleanor?" Miss Marple pressed. "Could have been," he said. "Could have been the young man, Whitmore." Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "No, I think not." Mr. Wilkes frowned. "Then who?" Miss Marple did not answer, because she already knew. That afternoon, Miss Marple requested that Daniel Whitmore meet her at the manor. He arrived promptly, his expression tense but controlled. "You said it was important," he said. "It is," Miss Marple replied. They stood in the drawing room, the same room where their earlier conversation had taken place, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a quiet finality in the air now. "I have spoken to the others," Miss Marple said. "Mrs. Harbury, Mr. Wilkes, the maid." Daniel's gaze sharpened. "And I believe I understand what happened on the night Lady Eleanor died." He held her gaze. "Do you?" "Yes." The word was soft but absolute. Miss Marple took a slow breath. "You came to Rosewood with a purpose," she said. "To confront the past. To make Lady Eleanor acknowledge what she had done." Daniel said nothing. "You succeeded in that," Miss Marple continued. "You spoke to her. You revealed who you were. You made her understand." A flicker of something, pain perhaps, passed through his eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. "But you did not kill her," Miss Marple said. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Daniel's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. "No," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "I did not think so," she said. He let out a slow breath. "Then who did?" Miss Marple met his gaze. "Someone who'd been waiting far longer than you," she said. "Waiting?" he repeated. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Waiting for the moment when the past would finally return, and bring with it an opportunity." Daniel frowned. "I don't understand." Miss Marple's voice softened. "Lady Eleanor had many secrets," she said. "And many of those secrets affected the lives of others. Clara Whitmore was only one of them." Daniel's expression tightened. "You mean—" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "There was someone else. Someone who had lived in her shadow. Someone who had seen the consequences of her actions, and never forgotten them." Daniel stared at her. "Who?" he asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned toward the doorway. "Perhaps," she said gently, "we should ask her ourselves." There was a soft sound behind them, a step, a presence, and then Mrs. Harbury entered the room. Her face was pale but composed. "You should not have involved him," she said quietly. Miss Marple regarded her steadily. "I did not," she replied. "You did." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Daniel looked between them, confusion giving way to something else. "Mrs. Harbury?" he said. "What is she talking about?" The housekeeper met his gaze, and for the first time there was no composure left. Only truth. "It's over," she said. Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "Yes," she said, "I believe it is." And in that quiet moment, the final layer of Rosewood's long-hidden secret began to lift. The room seemed smaller somehow. Not physically. Its high ceilings and tall windows remained unchanged. But the presence of truth had a way of closing in, of pressing against the walls until there was no space left for pretense. Daniel Whitmore stood motionless, his gaze fixed on Mrs. Harbury. "You?" he said quietly. It was not disbelief so much as something deeper, a struggle to reconcile what he'd believed with what now stood before him. Mrs. Harbury did not look away. "Yes," she said. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, only a quiet patience, as though she'd simply reached the inevitable conclusion of a long and careful process. "It is best," she said gently, "if we hear everything." Mrs. Harbury gave a faint nod. "Yes," she said. "It is time." She moved slowly into the room, her posture still composed but no longer guarded. The years she had spent in service seemed to fall away, revealing something far more personal beneath. "I have been in this house most of my life," she began, "long enough to see what it does to people, long enough to understand what it hides." Daniel said nothing, but his attention did not waver. "I was not always Mrs. Harbury," she continued. "Once, I had another name." Miss Marple's eyes rested on her calmly. "Margaret Hale," she said. Mrs. Harbury inclined her head slightly. "Yes?" Daniel frowned. "I don't understand." "You wouldn't," she said. "No one remembers that name. It was never meant to be remembered." Miss Marple spoke softly. "But you remember?" "Yes," Mrs. Harbury said. "I remember everything." She turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window as though seeing something far beyond it. "My sister worked here," she said, "many years ago, before your mother." Daniel stiffened. "She was younger than me," Mrs. Harbury continued, and brighter, full of hope. She believed in things, love, kindness, the idea that people were better than they appeared. Miss Marple said nothing. "She became involved with someone from the house," Mrs. Harbury went on. "Not Richard Ashford, someone else. But it ended the same way these things always do." Her voice did not rise, but it carried a quiet intensity. "She was dismissed," she said. "Sent away. No references, no support." "Nothing?" Daniel's expression darkened. "What happened to her?" Mrs. Harbury's gaze lowered. "She didn't survive it," she said. The words fell into the silence like something fragile and irrevocable. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Yes," she said softly. "I thought as much." Daniel looked between them, his voice tense. "And you believe Lady Eleanor was responsible?" Mrs. Harbury's expression hardened. "Responsible," she repeated. "She controlled everything that happened in this house. Nothing occurred without her knowledge. Nothing was allowed to remain that might tarnish the Ashford name." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Including your sister?" "Yes." "And Clara Whitmore," Miss Marple added gently. Mrs. Harbury gave a slow nod. "Yes, I saw it happen again. The same pattern, the same silence, the same erasure." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his voice strained. "And you stayed?" he asked. "After all that, you stayed here?" Mrs. Harbury looked at him steadily. "Where else was I to go?" she said. "This house had already taken everything from me. I chose to remain and watch." Miss Marple spoke quietly. "And wait." "Yes," Mrs. Harbury said. The word lingered. "Wait. Years of it. Decades, perhaps." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "You waited for an opportunity," she said. Mrs. Harbury did not deny it. "Yes," Daniel's voice sharpened. "And when I arrived, you saw your chance." Mrs. Harbury turned to him. "You brought the past back into this house," she said. "You forced it into the open. For the first time in years, Lady Eleanor had to face what she had done." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Which created the perfect moment." "Yes," Mrs. Harbury said. There was a long silence. Then Miss Marple spoke. "The glass," she said. Mrs. Harbury's eyes flickered briefly. "Yes." "You prepared it," Miss Marple continued, "as you always did. But this time, you changed something." Mrs. Harbury did not answer immediately. Then she said very quietly, "Yes." Daniel took a step forward. "You poisoned her?" The word hung in the air. Mrs. Harbury met his gaze. "I gave her something she had long deserved," she said. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "A stronger dose of her medicine," she said. "Enough to stop her heart." "Yes," Mrs. Harbury replied. The simplicity of it was striking. No violence, no struggle, just a small adjustment, almost invisible. "And then," Miss Marple continued, "you left the tray as usual. Allowed everything to appear unchanged." Mrs. Harbury nodded. "No one questioned it," she said. "Why would they? She was old. It was expected." Miss Marple regarded her steadily. "But you did not expect Mr. Whitmore's presence to complicate matters." A flicker of something passed across Mrs. Harbury's face. "No," she admitted. "That was unexpected." Daniel's voice was low. "You let them think it was me," he said. Mrs. Harbury did not look away. "I did not accuse you," she said. "No," he replied. "You didn't have to." Miss Marple rose slowly to her feet. "There is one thing I do not understand," she said. Mrs. Harbury looked at her. "You have waited all these years," Miss Marple continued. "You have carried this with you, quietly, patiently. Why act now?" Mrs. Harbury was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke. "Because she was never going to answer for it," she said. "Not truly. Not while she still held power. Not while the past remained buried." Her gaze shifted briefly to Daniel. "But when he came, when the truth returned, I knew it was the only moment that would ever exist." The room fell silent once more. Miss Marple studied her carefully. "And now?" she asked. Mrs. Harbury's expression did not change. "Now it is finished," she said. There was no hysteria, no attempt to flee, only a quiet acceptance. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "I believe it is." Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves. Inside Rosewood Manor, the long silence that had protected its secrets for so many years had finally been broken. Not with violence, not with chaos, but with truth. And as Miss Marple stood there, she knew that what remained now was not mystery, but consequence. In the end, Miss Marple often reflected, it was not the crime itself that lingered most strongly, but what remained after it. The silence, the consequences, and the quiet rearranging of lives that followed truth. The events at Rosewood Manor concluded not with drama, but with a calm inevitability that seemed almost fitting for a house that had held its secrets so tightly for so long. Mrs. Harbury, Margaret Hale, did not resist. When the authorities were called, she spoke with the same composed clarity she had shown in the drawing-room. There were no denials, no attempts at justification beyond what had already been said. Her actions, she made clear, had not been impulsive. They had been deliberate, measured, long in the making, and in a curious way that made them all the more unsettling. Miss Marple did not accompany her when she was taken away. She had never believed in witnessing endings that served no purpose. The truth had been uncovered. That was enough. Rosewood, however, did not return immediately to its former quiet. Villages rarely did. There were conversations, of course, hushed at first, then increasingly open as the days passed. Names that had not been spoken for years were brought back into the light. Stories, once dismissed as rumour or quietly ignored, were reconsidered with new understanding. Clara Whitmore, Margaret Hale's sister, others perhaps whose lives had brushed too closely against the rigid authority of Lady Eleanor Ashford. Miss Marple observed it all with gentle attentiveness. "Memory," she remarked one afternoon to Mrs. Cartwright, "has a way of correcting itself when given the opportunity." The innkeeper shook her head. "It's a terrible thing when you think of it. All those years, all that silence." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Terrible, but not uncommon." Daniel Whitmore remained at Rosewood Manor for several days after the truth had come to light. His presence, once a source of suspicion and curiosity, now carried a different weight. He was no longer an impostor in the eyes of the village, nor quite an heir. Something more complicated, something that did not fit neatly into any one role. Miss Marple found him one evening in the garden, standing near the overgrown rose beds. The air was cool, the fading light casting everything in soft shades of gold and grey. "You're leaving," she said, approaching quietly. He turned, a faint smile touching his lips. "Tomorrow," Miss Marple nodded. "And how do you feel about that?" Daniel considered the question. "I'm not sure," he said at last. "I came here looking for something. Answers, I suppose. Or perhaps acknowledgement." "And did you find it?" Miss Marple asked. He hesitated. "Yes," he said, "though not in the way I expected." Miss Marple smiled gently. "It rarely is." They stood in silence for a moment, the faint scent of roses lingering in the air. "I didn't intend for any of this to happen," Daniel said suddenly. "The death, the consequences." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "No, I believe that is true. But I set it in motion," he continued. "If I hadn't come—" "Then something else would have happened," Miss Marple said quietly. "Perhaps not at that moment, perhaps not in that way. But the past, Mr. Whitmore, does not simply disappear. It waits. He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. And then, Miss Marple said, it finds its way back. Daniel exhaled slowly. I thought I wanted justice, he said. But now... Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Now you're not so certain what justice looks like. No, he admitted. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Justice, she said, is rarely as clear as we would like. It is shaped by people, by their choices, their limitations, their regrets. She paused. And sometimes it arrives in ways that leave us with more questions than answers. Daniel gave a faint, rueful smile. That seems about right. As the light continued to fade, Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the manor. What will become of the house? She asked. Daniel followed her gaze. I haven't decided, he said. Legally, I have no claim, not really, and even if I did... He trailed off. Miss Marple understood. Some places, she said softly, are better left to memory. Yes, he said. I think so. The following morning, Daniel Whitmore left Rosewood. There was no ceremony, no farewell gathering. He departed quietly as he had arrived, leaving behind a village that would remember him, but perhaps never fully understand him. Miss Marple watched from the window of the inn as he disappeared down the narrow lane, the same path she herself had taken upon her arrival. Endings, she murmured, are seldom as tidy as one might wish. Later that day she took a final walk through the village. The church stood as it always had, its bell silent but steady. The post office bustled with its usual small routines. The cottages, the gardens, the familiar paths, all unchanged on the surface. And yet, beneath that surface something had shifted. Rosewood had remembered, and in remembering, it had begun, quietly, imperfectly, to understand. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the village, her gaze drifting once more toward Rosewood Manor. It stood in the distance, its windows dark, its presence less imposing now than it had been before. The house had lost something, not its structure, nor its history, but its silence. And that, Miss Marple thought, was no small thing. She adjusted her shawl and turned back toward the inn. There would be a train to catch, in due course. Another village, another set of small observations waiting to be made. But for now she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. A missing heir, she said softly. A hidden past. And a truth that refused to remain buried. She smiled faintly. Yes, she added. Quite a puzzle. In Rosewood, the mystery of the missing heir had never truly been about inheritance. It had been about memory, about the lives altered by silence, the truths concealed by power, and the quiet persistence of those who refused to forget. Miss Marple, with her gentle manner and sharp understanding of human nature, had not merely uncovered a deception, she had revealed something deeper. That the past, no matter how carefully hidden, carries within it the seeds of its own return. And when it does return, it does not ask permission. It simply waits. Until someone is ready to see it clearly.